Now, the second speaker is Mariann Bienz. And Mariann has been an integral part of LMB for almost 30 years now. Mariann came from Zurich, where she obtained her PhD. And then she came to the LMB initially to do postdoctoral work, where she worked on the heat shock response. Mariann then went back to Zurich, where she ran her own group for a number of years before she came back to LMB in 1991, and she's been here ever since. You're not going to hear about Mariann talking about her own research, but she's made a number of really important contributions to signaling pathways that regulate development, and really in the most recent years, primarily on the Wnt signaling pathway, which is crucial not only for development, but also cancer. And so for all of these research contributions, Mariann's been honored by numerous awards and has been elected to EMBO. She's been elected a Fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and also a Fellow of the Royal Society. Now, during her time at the LMB, Mariann not only ran a highly productive research group, but she has served as head of the cell biology division, and then subsequently head of the protein and nucleic acid chemistry division. And for the past 2 years, Mariann has been a deputy director. And I tell you this because she's going to draw on all of these experiences and kind of her 30 years here to tell you really what the secret to the LMB is. And I have to admit, I'm quite curious to hear about this myself.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to the second LMB culture talk. Well, some of you may have heard the first one about 2 months ago, given by Richard Henderson, who very much told you about how the LMB culture evolved over the years. And I thought I'd now like to continue much in the same vein, but focus on the here and now. So I borrowed my title, Recipe for Success, from this book that Kathy Weston wrote, and that's going to come out in November. And I highly recommend to all of you. It is about the science of the LMB over the last 60 years, but done by the women who work there. And Kathy, in her last chapter, very much asked the same question. What is it about LMB, and was it that helped these women to be successful? And that's what I'd like to do now. And with success, well, what I mean is not the Nobel Prizes, because no one can give you a recipe how to win a Nobel Prize. But what I mean is the work of everyone, every student, every postdoc, every group leader. So what do we do at LMB? What really is common to all of our work is that we try to gain insights into fundamental biological problems at the molecular mechanistic level. And success is defined as discovering something new and important. As Cynthia Kenyon said, we were postdocs together in the 80s. So it doesn't have to be flashy, and it doesn't even have to be interesting, because biology is sometimes boring, but it's got to be new and important. And here is the vision that Max Perutz, years and years ago, in the late 50s, wrote to the MRC when he had this idea that he would like to start an institute, and where we could study structure and function from a new unified point. He meant from all directions. And this, of course, would require a lot of collaborations, but also a lot of different disciplines, different materials, and different techniques. And obviously, he was successful in persuading the MRC to fund us. And I'm really quite amazed that this is what the LMB still absolutely is all about. And I just like to show you a few vignettes to illustrate this. So structural biology has always been at the heart of the work at the LMB. For example, this iconic structure of the hemoglobin, which won Max the Nobel Prize. But what was really interesting was that his student, Hilary Muirhead, she discovered by, again, a structural approach, this allosteric effect that happens when oxygen binds to this protein. So it really was perhaps one of the first examples which illustrates that if you want to learn about function of a molecule, you need to know its structure. And that's very deeply ingrained in many of us. But the work is very broad at the LMB, always has been. So it reaches, on the one hand, all the way to systemic approaches in model systems, like the talk you've just heard from Madeleine, or here, Greg Jeffries, who is working on the wiring of the fly brain. This work, again, dates back to when John White and people mapped the neurosystem of the nematode. But then on the other end of the spectrum are the chemists, our pure chemists, headed by John Sutherland, and they work probably on the most fundamental question of all, namely on the chemical origin of all the biomolecules that we know so well and love, that underpin biology. And I very much hope that John would be willing to tell us about his work in some of the next talks. Now, synergy is also an incredibly important element, as Max envisaged it. And here is one of the perhaps oldest, best established collaboration between two different groups in two different divisions. Andrew Carter on the one hand, who is very much takes a structural approach to learn about dynein motor complexes in general. And on the other hand, Simon Bullock, who is coming from the organism side, from the flies, which have this localized RNA, and that of course depends on motors. So the two groups have been collaborating formally and informally over the years to be able to tackle this problem from all angles. And you can see how powerful this would be. But actually, you can even do this in your own group because of the help you get. I'll come to in a sec. So really, what are the key ingredients into this recipe for success? Well, we have to start with money, of course. So we are core-funded by the MOC, as I've just told you. This happens to be our Christmas raffle drum. And the MOC pays, of course, a lot more than these puny sums that are written on stickers that we raise for charity every year. So the MOC pays about 80% or so of all our bills for consumables, salaries, equipment, what have you, electricity bill, the lot. And the rest is personal fellowships and some grants. So we really don't need to write grants. And that's particularly valuable for the young group leader whom we positively discourage from writing grants. So they can, in fact, all of us group leaders can really focus on the work and can tackle difficult problems that take a long time to solve. But what's really special about LMB, and quite unique, I believe, is that we do not have group budgets. So we just have one core grant and we share it all. Groups aren't limited by these artificial numbers, spend numbers that they have to reach every month or can't go over, but they can just go buying their reagents, getting their equipment as their science demands it. And this has an unbelievable effect on the behavior of people, because not only are they used to sharing, because it's all communal, doesn't belong to you specifically, but they're also very open to sharing their own time, their ideas, their expertise. They're very willing to help you. And I've just not seen a place where this is so deeply ingrained. And you can imagine, this is of course fantastic for the progress. And every management consultant would say, this is bonkers. This is not best practice. You should have group budgets. But just the opposite is the case. They couldn't be more wrong, because actually, through all the sharing, it becomes cheaper. And from a money point of view, we're always scoring very highly on value for money when we get reviewed by the MRC every 5 years. So not only is it cheaper, but it's fantastic for the science, but we do have to defend this principle regularly to outsiders. I very thoroughly recommend all of you to try this. It works wonders. Now the second element is also a bit counterintuitive, and that's we have small groups. So here is Kelly Nguyen, who joined us about a year ago and has started working with her 3 people on telomerase function. So she, like all other tenure-track young group leaders, will over the years grow a little until they reach the size of 8, which is the average size across all the tenure group leaders at LMB. This is Felix Rando and his people in wetsuits, which they don't, of course, always wear. So, but 8 people is bang on the average across the groups. Some have a bit more, some a bit less. And this counts everyone, visitors and all. So this is quite small, and many of you will work in larger groups, but it has distinct advantages. One of these is that the group leader directly supervises everyone in his group on a daily basis. He's often in the lab. They work themselves, especially the young ones. Everyone counts, every student, every postdoc. That's great for them. They're not just some random person who is in a godforsaken project. No one is interested. But most importantly, it really forces us to think very carefully which problems and questions we want to tackle. And this is important. Now, we wouldn't be competitive in these small groups if it weren't for all these facilities that we have, very broad range. Now, you will all have facilities in your institute, hopefully, and their work is tailored to your work, but typically facilities provide services. In our case, we're trying to involve the facilities as much as possible with the science itself and make them as freely accessible as possible. So the facilities are hosted in the divisions, close to the scientists. And Greg Winter, when he was interim director several years ago, excuse me, he came up with this formula, rule of thumb, that they should spend a third of their time each on collaborations, technical development, and also service. So some facilities to collaborate varies, of course, depending on the nature of the work, but some have a very emphasis on collaborations. For example, NMR here, where they essentially don't provide any service, but the spectroscopists will always talk to the scientists who want to do a project and sit down and devise the best way to answer questions directly. So they're very heavily involved and directly involved, which is fantastic and so much benefits to work. Water crystallography here, again, very essential, of course, for the structural biology, but also for people like us. If you're a fly group, have no expertise in structural biology, but you happen to have a good postdoc who is excellent biochemist, they can just purify the protein that you're trying to study and learn about the function. Wander down the corridor, put it into the robot, and which is of course developed by Fabrice over the years, thousands of conditions, and he will know after a few days whether the protein crystallizes. So unbelievably enabling, as you can imagine, not just for the specialists, for the professionals, but also for those who lack the expertise. And the same is of course true for the other facilities, which I won't talk about now. But then you also need some non-scientific support, because there are all these things that need to be done, which have nothing to do with science, but needed to support it. And here is a meeting of all the divisional administrators, which sit in their pods in the divisions in the center, and they are really the contact point between all the scientists and these other wonderful elves and fairies behind the scenes who work out the stuff about finance and health and safety, all the stuff that we scientists really just can't be bothered with, but which is absolutely essential to make the oil in the machine to make it run. But what's so special about all these people at LMB, and it still amazes me how all pervasive this attitude is, how they all buy in to this attitude that they are here to help us, the scientists, and to make things easy, rather than throwing spanners in the work, which sometimes is the case elsewhere. So huge heartfelt thank you to all of you guys and girls. And then we have the canteen. This is what I call the stairways to heaven. It's taken from the top, so heaven is the canteen. We always had a canteen since Max's day, when his wife made sandwiches for his handful of colleagues. The canteen has always been on top of the building, where it's light and views, and we have it here again in our new building. And this is really the most important communal space where people come and eat, have coffee and tea, and eat and discuss their stuff, relax of course, but also talk about their science, challenge each other occasionally. In the 80s, I used to be asked, Mariann, what's new? And is this really the most important question you should be asking? This was the kind of conversation we used to have. And I think there's still a lot of that going on. And that's where everybody can mingle. And just a final word about governance. We have, of course, a director, like all of your institutes, and that's Jan Löwe here. But Jan doesn't just decide on his own. He works with this whole grouping here, which contains all the divisional heads who are responsible for the work and space in their division. But it also has Kevin Morton, who looks after the operations, the people I showed you 2 slides ago. And we have Lali Ramakrishnan, who represents the university groups that we are hosting in one of our wings. And it's really all these people who come together on a monthly basis, well, termly basis, to discuss all the important issues like recruitment, funding, equipment, personal salaries, and so on. And the decision is really very democratic. We keep each other honest, I think, on our toes, so no one can get away with doing something stupid, which helps. But really, it's the science-first attitude that's the bottom of it. So I've been in this grouping now for quite a while, and very few occasions where politics come in, which is wonderful. And then this grouping, of course, is also the guardian of what I've been telling you about, this magical LMB ethos, because these are the most senior people who've been here the longest. And all of this should really equip us to do what we hope to do, namely simply to discover the truth. So you will say, we all are discovering the truth, of course, and I really hope we do. But we all know that truth has become somewhat fragile in recent years with all the social media and all the fake news and stuff. So it's not that clear anymore that truth will always win in science. I'm not quite as optimistic as Max, who said that. However, well, there's also this problem of the grants. If you are in the grant system and constantly under pressure to publish a paper, it is all too easy to cut a few corners and not do the last control experiment. And that then, of course, ends up being rubbish, and that's quite difficult then, contaminates the literature, and it's becoming increasingly difficult to really know which papers are right and which ones are not quite right. But anyway, I hope that all of us who work in institutes are really best placed to put the truth top above everything else. And certainly at LMB, Sidney Brenner used to say repeatedly that every paper should be comprehensive, accurate, and permanent. So stand the test of time, like the salmonite here in the floor of our restaurant. And with this, I would like to close and perhaps take a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariann. That was very informative. Indeed, it was a very nice compliment to Richard Henderson's talk a couple of months ago. And I also think that your model really resonates deeply with many of the Janelians on this call. So as the audience questions are coming in, I'm going to ask one that maybe other people are wondering. Is the food good in heaven?
Oh, it's wonderful. although we used to have a time when it was even better. However, a lot of people bring their own food. We have all these microwaves, but they all still come upstairs to eat it and to mingle.
Yes.
It's just fantastic.
That's excellent. Okay, but moving on to more serious questions, I am particularly interested by the collaborative spirit that you mentioned, freely sharing ideas, materials, expertise. But I'm wondering, how does the culture and environment at LMB really act to support and reinforce this very important value?
That's a very good question. And there is really nothing we do specifically to keep it going. I really, really do think it's ultimately down to this business that we don't have group budgets, that everything is communal. There are no boundaries between groups, sometimes not even physical lab boundaries. And that just sort of, as the spirit permeates, that when people set an example, you go and ask someone something, they have time for you. But they don't really spend time administering their kingdom. I used to work in a university, and there it was all about kingdom administration, not about doing the science. But when all you're doing is science, and that's top of your mind, your first priority, that's what you want to do. Of course, you want to help each other. And as soon as someone is helpful, that person back will help. It's the way you call into the wood. The same thing comes back. I think it's as simple as that.
Sure. A question from Jag in the audience. Jag says that was a very great overview, but surely there must be some disagreement about research directions. How might these be handled when they arise?
Well, I hope I didn't imply that anybody is imposing any research directions. Quite the contrary. Everyone every group has to decide on their own direction, and that comes, of course, there's their own ideas, their own past, and so on. This is all completely bottom up. Or did I understand the question wrongly?
No, I think that you fielded it actually just fine. Let's move on to a question from Lamore Joshua Tor. Lamore says, thank you very much. LMB is a wonderful jewel. She wants to know, how do you handle promotions of the faculty with this model, specifically with regard to the very long-term projects?
Yes, absolutely. That's an excellent question. And it creates us actually often headaches, because we want our young group leaders to be really ambitious and to set out for the long term, as I said. However, that may just not pan out within we have about 6 years by the time we need to reach some kind of decision. But it all depends what the expectation is, and what we're really expecting is the group leader to come. We hired them because they have a really good idea that we like, a really good problem that they want to tackle. So we support them as much as we can. They give us after 3 years, a progress report. And with us, I mean the executive committee, that grouping that I showed you at the end, just to see what they've actually done. And these are fantastic sessions. I absolutely love them. You learn so much. And it's very much a forth and back. I think it's the young group leaders like them too. So after that, the divisional heads will give them an indication how they're doing. They don't have to have published a paper. All they have to have done is made clear progress towards their goal. And that's kind of obvious. Sometimes it's not completely obvious, but then we have time. We can do another 3 years at least. And indeed, flexibility is one of these things that I didn't mention that we're also very strong on. Richard will remember, he used to say, we have a deliberate anarchy at the LMB. It's no longer, can't be quite as anarchic as it used to be. It's a little bit more regulated for a number of reasons. However, we are fully flexible. If we think someone just needs a bit more time to get to that key breakthrough, to that key first paper, which puts them on the map, we can do that.
Sure. And sort of related to that, a question from Carl Svoboda is, do you in fact take collaboration and collegiality into account when evaluating group leaders for promotion?
Oh, absolutely. Definitely. Yeah. Yes. No, this seemed to be a very desirable thing. Now, as always, everywhere, you would obviously, no one can be a professional collaborator who manages everybody else, you know, this sort of operator science. We don't do that. There is always a strong element in every group of driving your own science, that the program that you decided to tackle. You drive it yourself, but you may collaborate with someone else. You will get help and you collaborate with facilities, other groups, and so on and so forth. So that's the ideal, but everybody helps driving.
Thank you, Mariann. We are definitely running over, but I'm going to ask one last question from Sunil Narayan, who wants to know, you know, within your group leader pool, you know, do you have people who have been primarily trained as clinicians, but with a lot of interest and understanding and experience in basic science within your group?
We do have some clinicians at LMB, and you may have seen on that first vision statement that Max Perutz wrote way back. He said biological samples and clinical samples or something. So we're not on the whole doing translational science as such, but we sometimes do. And there's a very famous example of Greg Winter, as you heard from Richard last time. It's all up to the individual, but especially in our division in PNSC, which is aimed at understanding human health and disease, ultimately, many of our programs are in the context of human disease, but they can also be in other divisions, like you heard the first talk from neuro in the context of Alzheimer, about the filaments, tau filaments. So definitely, and we have some clinician also at the postdoc level, and 2 group leaders in PNSC were trained clinicians. One of these has just left. Mm-hmm. That does help, of course, to inform a little bit on the translational side, if you wish. But then there is the hospital is right next door on the campus, and many of us know some of the clinicians there. And the cancer center is there in Cambridge. So there is quite a bit of influence in that direction. However, some groups really do want to and should do simply fundamental science, like John Sutherland's example I mentioned. This is pure fundamental questions. How did life originate? And this won't have any direct applications to anything, maybe indirect, But this is definitely desirable, and that's what we've always done at LMB.
Great, thank you. And one last question came in. I think it's a tough one, but it's a really good one. So I'm going to pose it. How do you quantify the collaborations and the success of the collaborations at LMB? And how do individuals and groups get credit for collaboration?
Yes, well, there's two answers to that. Internal evaluation, which obviously is key when it comes to tenuring people, and external evaluation, which is when visiting committees come in from all over the world, many of whom don't work in institutes, who may have slightly different outlook on life and science than us. So the two are different. Internally, we don't do metrics. We just don't do metrics. We look at the case, we read the papers, we talk to people, we make our own judgment on the pure science. Now the external evaluation, so we can factor in collaborations as it will be obvious that this is a key part of someone's progress. Now the external evaluation is much more tricky because the MRC insists on doing metrics. We get graded even. It feels like going to school, but never mind. Although we all have egos, we should be able to take that. And we have to, of course, be accountable. We understand that. But there it's much harder. And there are particularly individuals in, for example, structural studies who don't necessarily run a standard group, but they underpin, they develop algorithms and stuff. They underpin the work in an unbelievably crucial way, but they may not come across as driving their own normal quote program. So the visiting committees always struggle a bit with these people who are here clearly to underpin the whole thing and love to do that. However, that's down to the skills of the divisional head to persuade the committee and to explain to them what the role of these people are. And by and large, they do understand that. So I hope I have answered this difficult question.
Wonderful. Yes, definitely. I think with that, we should conclude. We're definitely well over time, but we had some really great discussion today. I want to finish just by once again thanking today's speakers, Madeline and Mariann. We really appreciate your talks. I want to thank the audience for being here. Please, if you did not get your questions answered, click on the link to our Slack channel, which I've shared in the chat. And the speakers will head over there and answer any additional questions. And also, please join us next week. We will head over to EMBL and we will hear talks from Janet Thornton and Lucia von Bordeaux. So I'll see everyone next week. Thank you.